There's my presentation. Thank you ever so much. And thank you all for being here after lunch and you're still awake. I'm really grateful. What I want to talk today about, invisible interfaces, visible impact, the subtitle focuses very much on measurement. But really what I do want to mention is that this is part of a three-part series that we've been working on at Phase 5. I've been talking about this a fair bit. And it's there's a piece on designing for an age of AI. This is part of the management and the measurement piece, and we're working actually on a governance piece as we speak. And a couple of things that I just want to point out before I get into the presentation per se. Where are we coming from, as it were, when I talk about AI? I'm not an AI engineer. Phase 5, our company, we're a research and insights company. We've got branding as a practice area, we have innovation, we have CX, we have UX. I happen to head up the UX practice. And since 2018, when I gave a talk in San Francisco arguing that in an increasingly digital world, UX and CX are going to have to work closely together to a point where the line between them will disappear. In our own company, our UX and CX teams have been working very well together. So what we have been doing, and Phase 5, I'm very proud to say, we had 30 years ago one of the very first UX labs for hire in this country. We've been studying experience. We study experience for our clients, from the London Stock Exchange Group to 3M to any number of Canadian companies on a regular basis, at a collective level, at an individual level. And we do that to help design products, to help develop product ideas, and so on and so forth. So where I'm coming from today, when I talk to you about the need to look at a new measurement framework for AI, I'm coming at it totally from the customer's point of view. And one of the things that Stephen mentioned in his talk recently, we have to revisit the KPIs. Keep an eye out for that, because I'm going to talk about that. That's quite central to this. The other piece that I just want to mention, and I think Stephen was referring to Geoffrey Hinton just now when he spoke about the godfather of AI. Why is this so urgent at this moment? I'm calling it a Promethean moment. Prometheus stole fire, famously, for humans, and was punished for eternity for it. What we get today, the moment in which we find ourselves today, is no different in terms of the impact it's going to have as Prometheus is stealing a fire, because this is going to change how we feel about consciousness, how we see ourselves ontologically, existentially, and if we believe Geoffrey Hinton, which I do, the window to take any kind of action is closing very rapidly upon us. And the reason why it is because not only is AI not static, but most importantly, AI self-generates and AI adapts. So what I want to do today is start with a little historical story, and then I want to talk a bit about what really has changed fundamentally in customer experience in an age of AI, so I can then make my case against legacy metrics and modes of governance, and make the case for what I'm going to present as new metrics, as well as I've got in my pocket from the companion piece the new heuristics, if you will, if you're designing for AI. But I want to take you back, way back to the 18th century. I want to take you back to when this man, Wolfgang von Kempelen, he decided to impress Maria Theresa. She was an empress in the court of Vienna. And the way he decided to do that was to build this machine that he called the Turk. It was called the Turk. It was an automaton that played chess, and it defeated everybody. And you can imagine the kind of interest that this generated amongst people. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, when he was in Paris as ambassador, he played and lost. Later on, Edgar Allan Poe wrote an essay on it, and Poe called it. He said, look, there was no machine intelligence. The so-called process that is invisible to the observer is actually probably a human being. There's probably human intelligence, and indeed that is exactly what it was. But where this is very interesting to us today in an age of AI is that just like the observers of this chess-playing automaton did not see the intelligence, the process behind the moves, they just saw the outcome. They saw the moves alone. So do we today live in a world where we as customers are being removed from what used to be a process, what used to be a journey, and are in fact instead being situated in that ultimate outcome. And I'm going to walk you through some examples. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about CX, when we talk about any kind of X for experience, what is it that held the customers or the users' experience? What do we mean by that? And this is where the interface is very important. If you look at the entire history of UX, if you will, it is a history of the interface. It started way back designing heavy machines, humans learning to talk in the language of machines, whether that was a gunboat where some farm boy from southern Ontario was suddenly put in front of a torpedo console during the Second World War, or whether it was later one of the big mainframe computers, but we had to learn the language of the machines. And then that paradigm flips in the 1970s in Xerox PARC, where we are told, no, hang on a second, you can speak human. The machine, on the other hand, will need to learn to understand you. And of course, since then, we have seen, purely for technological reasons, even mechanical reasons, the interface has been shrinking so much so that I carry in my pocket now a phone that is multiple times the power of any computer that sent human beings to the moon. But where the age of AI and the disappearing interface is very interesting is that, imagine this, you walk into a room today, and this precedes the LLMs and the kind of AI everyone's talking about, generative AI, but it uses AI nonetheless, the Internet of Things. You walk into a room, the lights go on. There is no interface. The interface was a switch, but you did not have to turn on that switch. Years ago, AOL, that interface, along with the little jingle that went with it, was in fact where the customer's experience for millions of Americans, that was the internet. So the interface is precisely where the brand was experienced. And we've been talking about journeys, we've been talking about multi-channel journeys. When we talk about any kind of journey, we are talking about the user or the customer interacting with an interface, whether it's a mechanical interface, a digital interface, or a human interface for that matter. And CX measurement, CX governance, CX design was all about designing both the individual interfaces as well as the journey that involved these multiple interfaces. But as with the example of the room lights turning on, what happens when the interface dissolves? Where does the brand live? Where does the customer experience actually live? What happens when you're applying for a loan or any number of things that involved a journey thus far, but I don't have to undertake a journey because what I would have done in the journey and put a whole bunch of information, or in the example, the simple example of a light switch, I went in there and I turned on the light, I used the switch. When that actually disappears, and all I'm left with is actually just the outcome. In other words, there was no immediate input, there was no journey, there was, however, an outcome. And this is very real. You see this, and I'll go through a couple of examples, you've all experienced this. You have the Apple Card. You are not filling out a long form because the system already has tacit data about you, or it is modeling data about you. What you do receive, though, is the outcome, and the outcome itself becomes the experience. You go into the medical field. You have Google's DeepMinds, and it's scouring through millions and millions of pixels, and it's then giving you a particular verdict, whether you are a clinician or you the patient, and it's telling you, well, the probability of diabetic retinopathy is 92%. Just like that chess-playing automaton, all you're seeing is that result. 92%, you either accept it or you don't. And likewise, when we shop online, Amazon or elsewhere, even the very first screen, that default, if you will, list of items that we are choosing from, that is not a neutral list. That itself is a result of algorithmic decision making, and then of course from there, there's price decisions and so on and so forth. So what happens here with this disappearing interface, and along with it, the disappearance of the customer journey? Right now we're in the rationalization phase. We are rationalizing customer journeys everywhere, but very quickly, as these examples show you, that's simply going to disappear. The blind spot is that the traditional metrics that we use, customer satisfaction, customer effort score, in fact, effort score very explicitly builds in the idea of the effort involved in the journey. What happens when it's no longer a journey that we have to measure? I want to take a slight detour, if you will, because it is contextually important to the ultimate thesis that I'm going to make. In a field of psychology called procedural justice, and there's a lot written on it, there is a white paper on this where I've got a reading list. As I said, there's a white paper on designing for UX in an age of AI, and this is the measurement piece. And in the white paper, there's a long reading list, and you'll see papers on procedural justice there. Tyler, Lind, and Walker do this. And what they study is how are bad or negative outcomes received by us. Because remember, the outcome is the fulcrum around which customer experience turns. And fairness, this whole idea of procedural justice, it hinges on something called fairness heuristics. So I'm going to skip over some of these so we have time for questions later on. The examples are very similar to the ones I gave you earlier on. The central thesis of this is very simple, and we can all understand this quite intuitively. We don't need academic papers for it. People accept bad news if they believe the process is fair. Now, in the country we live in Western or Western-influenced countries around the world, it's built into our social contract, our justice system, and what is built into it are a couple of things. One, there is a process that if I choose to understand what that process is, I have access to it, there's transparency. Two, belief that the process is fair. And three, an appeal system. There is a way, if I'm not happy with that particular process, to seek recourse. Now, what happens when we receive outcomes, whether it's a speeding ticket or whether it's a credit card denied or whatever it may be? We are much more willing to accept this outcome if we deem it to be fair. And the word heuristics is used by the psychologists because this is something that we ascertain in a moment, in the moment of experience. Now, keep in mind, I'm using the word moment. We can't objectively quantify a moment. A moment is a unit of experience. It could be a few seconds, depending on what the event was. It could be chronologically longer or shorter. But a moment is measured really by its impact. So what happens in the moment of our receiving a decision? What we do internally very quickly is ask ourselves whether we think the process was transparent, whether we believe that the process was actually fair. So we know, for instance, that when we get a speeding ticket, if someone tells us, you were speeding, here's a ticket, that's very different from simply meeting a police officer who says, well, you know, this is your ticket, I'm not going to tell you why or what it is you were doing. The second piece, as I mentioned, is recourse confidence. That is extremely important. If you look at a very common example, buying clothes online. What gives people the confidence to buy clothes online? Depending on which study you believe, the return rate of shirts bought online is actually very low. Something like 4 to 5% of those who purchase shirts online ever actually return it. But the fact that they're given a particular guarantee is what gives them that security, that courage, if you will, in the moment of shopping to go ahead and pull the trigger. And an example that's a lot closer to home, although it's a little bit old now, years ago, when we at Phase 5 were working with the banks and doing some foundational work on developing UX for online banking when this was very, very new. And there were common misperceptions around how this works, about all sorts of questions and so on. I still remember the impact that a simple yellow badge on the authentication screen, it wasn't a guarantee, banks don't give guarantees, except on a GIC with a lot of caveats, but there was assurance. It was a very strong assurance statement about what the bank would do in case something went wrong. It was simple, and we worked on that. So again, recourse confidence. The other key aspect of the customer experience that we are talking about here in an AI-dominated and an AI-powered, AI-driven world is emotional immediacy. If you think about how we think about CX, how we measure CX, in fact, how we measure things tells us a lot about how we conceptualize them, how we think about them, how we govern. We govern as we measure. And today, the way we think about CX is a bit retrospective. You, the customer, have an experience. I then go and talk to you after a while. They'll ask you about a sort of an aggregate impressionistic score like NPS, or perhaps more immediate, I'll ask you about your effort, I'll ask you about satisfaction, and so on and so forth. But it happens a little bit after the fact, and also, given that I've undergone a journey, let's say I went through a mortgage application, it took 2 weeks or 3 weeks, what I'm scoring you on is itself reflective of a longitudinal process. But when the application per se was really just press a button here because you have, or you believe you have all the data about me that you need to adjudicate my process, and then I get the outcome in the next second or so, it is that very moment in which my impression of the brand, of you as an organization as a purveyor of that product or service, that is where it has that impact. That's where it starts solidifying and even calcifying. So when we look at the legacy CX metrics, which, as I was mentioning, adumbrate the governance of CX today, and the classic NPS, CSAT, and CES, the only one that remains somewhat valid today is NPS. And I say that because at the end of the day, the NPS is really a brand score, and there's a reason why it's often today used in SEC filings and so on and so forth. But CSAT, think about this. CSAT is about customer satisfaction. CES is a customer effort score. In the example of an app where I'm applying for a credit card or a mortgage or a loan, or if you'll allow me, let's fantasize a bit further. You're playing a game of Grand Theft Auto, let's say 2 years from now, in a true open banking scenario. You actually, while you're playing, you see an RBC or a TD or maybe a Money Mart building that you're driving your stolen car through, or whatever it is you're doing, and you decide, hey, I want a loan. And within that game, you're able to pop in there and apply because there's a pre-application waiting for you. This is going to happen. My effort is zero because the organization has actually removed that entire burden of filling out forms for me. It's got everything ready and is simply asking me to apply, which is fantastic if I get what I think I'm going to get. It is absolutely catastrophic if the exact opposite happens, and depending on how badly I need it or think I need it, the effort, both on me as a person and my reflection, my impression of the organization, my CX score, if you will, goes completely down the toilet. So you can have a perverse example of customer effort score, or with the lights turning on, you walk in, as long as the lights turn on, that's fantastic. Your CES score is very high, it had no effort at all. What if the lights don't turn on? Now, all of a sudden, there is no switch that you can simply turn on and off to rectify what didn't happen. What does that do to your CES score, even though, of course, there was no effort involved at all? So what we've been working with, the framework that has evolved at Phase 5, and we're working with our clients on this, both on the UX side, designing for an AI-driven world, as well as its companion piece, which is measuring for an AI-driven world. It's built on three attributes: trust, alignment, and recourse. Trust. Are outcomes explainable? Do I know why I got the score that I got, the answer that I got, the outcome that I received? Let's take, for instance, one of these, a mortgage application in our new and shining world of AI. I'm denied the mortgage, or I'm denied the credit card limit increase, or whatever it is. Instead of simply being given the decision, if I am given, let's say, a scorecard, you don't have to reveal your internal actuarial parameters. You don't have to give me the recipe to your secret sauce. But much like the policeman actually handing you, let's say, radar documentation or a parking ticket that clearly explains where you went wrong, if you give me a matrix that shows me what I was scored on, and even traffic lights, red, yellow, green, showing me where I did well and where I didn't, there's explainability, there is some transparency. And we've got in that design piece a whole range of heuristics, in fact, for TAR, alignment, and recourse, very much, in fact, like at the dawn of the internet world, or the World Wide Web world, I should say. Nielsen and Norman had their list of 10 heuristics for web design. So have we designed heuristics for designing in a world of AI. But back to measurement. Trust, are outcomes explainable? Do I understand it? Alignment, which is a very, very big piece, and those of you who are on the technical side of things working with AI, of course, when I say alignment, you'll instantly think about drift. A very common and relatable example of AI drift is from the news from last year when we had DeepSeek calling itself, referring to itself as ChatGPT. It happened to me. It was the day that DeepSeek was released, and I was working on a probability equation on it, and you had a drift. That was an extreme case of identity drift, but there are many reasons why it can happen. Data contamination, drift of the training model. In fact, in 2024, Anthropic's Claude was discovered by Anthropic's engineers to have drifted so far that it actually started changing and developing its own new features. And again, in the white paper, we have a link to that whole article. And while the engineers were able to fix the ones that they found, they were not, in fact, able to find all of the nodes that they needed to fix. And Dario Amodei is the only CEO talking about this quite seriously, the AI's black box problem and the potential for drift. So, is the AI, is the system that I, the user, am interacting with, is it still aligned with the original purpose for which it was built, or has it moved away from it? Another common example related example of misalignment and drift is in, say, a trading algorithm which starts picking up in behavior from short-term rewards and then starts deviating from the risk parameters to uphold which it was built in the first place. So is there trust? Is there alignment? And much like buying a shirt online, is there recourse? And the new metrics that we are proposing, and right now we are working with a couple of our clients to actually launch this so we can come back with results and give you very concrete examples of how actual numbers correlate, how this new CX index, if you will, would actually operate in the real world. And if anyone is interested, by the way, do talk to Stefan if you raise your hand. If you're interested in partnering with us, we'd be very happy to talk to you. So what you see over here, the top 6 metrics are still based on surveys, are based on an interrogatory method, much like all CX measures, not all, much as those big scores that I mentioned are done today. But the difference is in what it is we are measuring and when it is we need to measure it. So what we want to measure, the pillars of this, are perceived fairness, decision clarity, brand alignment, recourse confidence, and very, very important, the actual emotion at the time of outcome. And the scales, etc., have been developed very much in keeping with the needs and the rigor, if you will, of research. What goes through the very bottom row are, of course, the passive signals, and I'm sure in this conference there's been a lot of talk about the importance of passive signals and the importance of regularly monitoring and parsing those passive signals and using these in tandem. So you've got perceived fairness, decision clarity, brand alignment, recourse confidence, and of course the emotional, the outcome emotion that's captured in the moment with point of sale or shortly thereafter surveys. And we've got the question wording and the scale options here, whether you're confident about how to get this decision received reviewed by a person, the human in the loop, the emotion, right now I feel, and so on and so forth, which we make the strong case, and I'm very glad to see that our clients are buying into it, for radically rethinking how we measure, what we measure, how we measure, and as a result, what we govern. And just as an example of how popular this has been, this is the fourth time this week, I believe today's Thursday, the fourth day of the week that I'm giving a version of this talk. So I'm very glad to see that this is something that's been resonant with our clients. In terms of the implementation roadmap, and I'm going to wrap up very soon, I mentioned microsurveys and passive sentiment tracking. That, of course, becomes very, very, very important, the real-time view of trust, and that's the T, if you will. The data linkage leads to governance. None of this, we don't measure for the sake of measuring. As I said, how we measure tells us a lot about how we think about something, how we conceptualize it, how we govern it. The two have to be linked. So where we are right now in working with our clients who have partnered with us, where we are rolling this out, is to be able to come back and say, we did X number of studies, and what we saw was this kind of correlation. An X% drop in perceived fairness leads to a Y% drop in, let's say, a hard metric like churn. So we've moved away. We're going to use what we are calling this new framework, the CX metrics, and link it to actual operational and business metrics and business commercials, so that there can actually be a governance dashboard, and all of these metrics start meaning something. When an executive sees a drop in perceived fairness or a rise in perceived fairness, they can actually make decisions, not necessarily related to the metrics and how CX is measured, but on the core businesses that they are, the business functions that they are in charge of. And benchmarking becomes particularly important. I don't need to tell a CX crowd why benchmarking is. The only thing I will note here is how quickly this will move. You're going to see, at least initially, we are in this brand new world. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the rationalization of the journey now, moving very quickly towards kind of eliminating what we have called the journey today, seeing where you are against your peers, not just overall, but in particular aspects of what you're measuring as well, so you know when there's a real, whether that's a canary in the coal mine and it's a real danger to you or not. So I will end where I began, with this automaton, the Turk. Intrigue in a hidden mind. It's the hidden mind that we do not understand, that we cannot see as customers, and yet whose decisions impact us in very large ways sometimes, and in very small ways all the time. So using TAR as an operating system based on trust, alignment, and recourse becomes fundamentally important. Thank you so much for listening.